The first time I had $10,000 in savings, I sat with my banking app open for a full minute just staring at the number. Not because I was proud, exactly, more because I genuinely hadn't believed it was going to happen. I'd been trying, off and on, for years before that, setting targets, starting over, watching balances creep up slowly, and then get wiped out by something I hadn't planned for. The 10,000 didn't arrive because I suddenly started earning more. My income was essentially the same. It arrived because 7 specific habits quietly changed how money moved through my life. And I want to talk about all 7 of them honestly, including the ones that took longer to work than I expected. Before I get into the habits themselves, I want to say something plainly that financial content usually doesn't. I tried to save money badly and inconsistently for several years before any of this worked. I had months where I was disciplined and months where I wasn't. Starts where I was motivated and abandoned systems that should have worked. The 10,000 didn't come out of a period of sudden discipline. It came out of finally building systems that didn't require discipline to keep running. That's the actual difference between when it worked and when it didn't, and it's the through line connecting all 7 habits on this list. Here's the thing about that number. $10,000 sounds like a milestone, and it is. But the reason it matters isn't the size of it. The Federal Reserve's most recent survey of consumer finances found that the conditional median balance held in transaction accounts, checking, savings, and money market accounts combined, was $8,000. And a 2025 survey from Credible found that 2/3 of Americans don't believe they'll ever save enough to feel financially secure, with 1 in 5 reporting $0 in savings at some point over the prior 6 months. None of that is about proving 10,000 ranks someone against everyone else. It's simply context for why reaching that number can feel so significant, because consistently building savings over time is something a lot of people struggle to do. The habits existed before the balance did. The balance was just what happened when the habits kept running long enough. These aren't tips. They're the actual things that changed my behavior, in the order they mattered. Habit 1. I stopped treating savings as the last thing that happened after everything else did. For years before this worked, savings was whatever was left at the end of a month. Which meant most months, there wasn't much, because spending has a way of filling whatever room it's given. Rent, groceries, going out, a few things I don't even remember buying. By the time those ran their course, the number I'd been planning to move into savings was already spoken for. I remember checking my balance on the last day of the month, genuinely intending to move $200 to savings, and finding $83 there. Not because I'd done anything reckless, just because $200 worth of small decisions had already happened before the month ended. The shift was almost embarrassingly simple. I automated a transfer for the same day my paycheck landed, not the next day, not at the end of the month, the same morning, before I'd opened any other app or made any other decision about the money. A flat amount moved into a separate account, and whatever was left in checking was what I had to work with for the next 2 weeks. The behavioral mechanism behind this is something researchers have documented consistently across savings and retirement contexts. In the early 2000s, behavioral economists Richard Thaler and Shlomo Benartzi developed a retirement savings program called Save More Tomorrow, built on a similar principle. Instead of asking employees to cut their current paycheck, they asked them to commit in advance to saving a slice of future raises, money they'd never held yet, and therefore never felt was theirs to lose. Employees who joined saw their savings rates rise substantially over just a few years, almost entirely on autopilot, because the contribution never registered as a sacrifice. The mechanism wasn't relying on discipline in the moment, it was committing in advance, before the money ever felt available to spend. The same mechanism works when automated savings moves before a single spending decision gets made. It was never quite mine to spend, so it didn't feel like a loss when it wasn't there. That reframe, from saving what's left to spending what's left after saving, was the foundation that made everything else on this list actually stick. In practice, The exact amount matters less than the timing. I started with $100 per paycheck, not enough to feel dramatic, small enough that it didn't break anything. But that wasn't where the contribution stayed. As the system became easier to live with, I gradually increased it, and every refund, bonus, and extra dollar I could reasonably spare went into the same account. The timing was everything. Same day the paycheck arrived, the transfer happened. Automation did what intention alone consistently failed to do. Habit 2. I kept the savings somewhere I couldn't easily reach. This sounds like it should go without saying, but I had years of savings sitting in the same bank where I spent money, showing up in the same app, on the same screen as checking. Every time I opened it to pay something, I could see the savings balance. Every time I could see it, I was one impulsive moment away from moving it. I remember one specific Saturday afternoon where I moved $300 out of savings for something I described to myself as urgent, that I genuinely cannot recall now. Not an emergency, just a moment where it was visible, and visible meant available. I moved the savings to a different bank entirely, no debit card attached to it. The transfer back to checking took 2 business days, which isn't a long time, rationally, but it's long enough that the impulse usually passes before the money arrives. The friction wasn't accidental, it was the entire point. This idea has a formal name in behavioral economics, the concept of nudges, developed by Richard Thaler and legal scholar Cass Sunstein, which holds that small environmental changes reliably change behavior more than appeals to willpower do. A 2-day transfer delay doesn't feel like much of a barrier in the abstract. In practice, it's the difference between a balance that stays and one that gets rated for a concert ticket or a flight deal that turns out not to be as urgent as it felt at 11 on a Thursday night. I used that friction on purpose, and I'd recommend it more confidently than almost any other thing on this list. The separate bank also happened to pay a meaningfully higher interest rate than the account I'd been using. As of 2026, many competitive high-yield savings accounts are paying around 4% APY, with some offers reaching roughly 4.5% depending on the account and its requirements. Rates that turn idle savings into something quietly growing rather than something just sitting. Not life-changing on its own at $10,000, but real. On a balance building toward $10,000, the difference between an account earning essentially nothing and one earning at those rates adds up to real dollars over months. A small reward for a decision that costs little more than a bit of research to make. Before moving to habit 3, I want to pause on something that I know will be sitting in the back of some people's minds by now. None of what I've described so far requires a high income, but it does require some margin, and I want to be honest about that rather than pretending the 7 habits are a universal fix. Habits 1 and 2, automation and friction, work significantly better when there's some margin to automate. The point where they become powerful is usually once there's something to move, even if that something is small. If the honest answer right now is that there's no margin at all, the more relevant question is probably whether income can increase before anything on this list becomes the main lever. And this channel has other videos dedicated specifically to that sequencing. Nothing here is meant to imply that behavior is the only issue, or that it's always the main one. For everyone for whom some margin does exist but keeps quietly disappearing before it reaches savings, which genuinely describes a lot of people across a wide range of incomes, habit 3 is where the system starts compounding on itself. Habit 3, I gave the savings a specific name and a specific target. Savings as a category is too vague to feel real. It's a bucket with no bottom and no top. You can put money in indefinitely without ever knowing whether you're close to done. At some point, I started labeling the account, actually renaming it inside the app, to something specific. For me, for a long stretch, it was simply called 10,000. A dumb, specific number staring back at me every time I logged in. Research on motivation has documented this pattern with some consistency. People are more likely to make regular contributions to a savings goal when it has a clear, specific target than when the goal is open-ended or vague. One mechanism is simple. A target makes progress visible. You're not just adding to an undefined pile, you're closing a gap. Another mechanism is emotional. When a number is named, it becomes real in a way it wasn't before, and the decision to spend money that could go toward it becomes a slightly more deliberate one. Should I buy this or get closer to 10,000? Is a different question than, should I buy this or add more to savings? Even when the underlying math is identical. I also noticed that naming it created a small but real psychological boost each time the balance moved upward. The account wasn't just a number, it was a named project I was actively working on. Each deposit felt like progress towards something specific rather than money disappearing into a vague abstraction. Once I'd hit the goal, I renamed it to whatever the next one was. But the 10,000 was the first real finish line I ever crossed, and I believe the label was part of why. One practical note: keeping the target small enough to actually finish matters as much as naming it. 10,000 was ambitious for me at the time, but it was reachable. I could see the math working over a reasonable horizon. A goal that's too large stays abstract no matter how clearly it's named. The first milestone should be big enough to matter and small enough to believe in simultaneously. Habit 4. I stopped tracking every category and started tracking one number. For a while, I tried the elaborate budget, categories for groceries, for eating out, for coffee, for entertainment, for the subcategory of entertainment that was specifically streaming services. I built it carefully in a spreadsheet one weekend and updated it faithfully for about 3 weeks. Then one Tuesday, I skipped updating it because I was tired and had other things to do, and I never opened it again. I've since met enough people with similar experiences to believe this isn't a character flaw. It's just what happens when a system is complex enough that one skipped day feels like too much to catch up on. The approach that actually lasted was simpler. I tracked one number. Every month, I looked at how much I'd saved as a percentage of what I'd taken home. That was the only metric I held myself to. If the savings rate went up month over month, things were moving in the right direction. If it dropped, I had one question to ask, not 41, and it was just, why? The behavioral reason this works ties back to something researchers call decision fatigue, the documented phenomenon where the quality of decisions deteriorates after a long sequence of them. A budget with dozens of categories requires dozens of micro-decisions, every week, every purchase. That's a real cognitive load, and the moment it feels heavier than the value it's providing, most people stop paying it. A single monthly check is a different kind of ask entirely. This also changed how I thought about individual purchases. Instead of asking, is this in budget for the coffee category this week, I just spent normally and checked the rate at the end of the month. If the rate was where I wanted it, I had no reason to audit a single purchase. If it was lower than I wanted, I had exactly one question to answer. What happened differently this month? And that question was often answerable in a few seconds. No spreadsheet required. No Sunday night guilt session, just one number, checked once, monthly. One caveat worth naming here: this only works if the savings rate isn't being quietly offset by new debt building up somewhere else. Moving $500 into savings while adding $500 to a credit card balance isn't actually moving you $500 forward, it just relocates the number. The one metric check assumes the rest of the picture is honest too, and it's worth glancing at total debt every so often to make sure it is. Habit 5. I treated every windfall as already saved before I spent any of it. This is one of the most specific habits I can name, and the one that probably accelerated reaching 10,000 faster than anything else. The actual mechanism is simple to explain and surprisingly hard to implement, because it requires acting before the money feels like it belongs to you. Tax refunds, bonuses, reimbursements, any money that arrived outside the normal paycheck, before any of it landed in checking, I moved it straight to the savings account. Not most of it, not after I set some aside for something nice. All of it, first, before I even finished reading the notification. I remember a specific tax refund of about $700. The previous year, a refund like that would have quietly become new clothes, a dinner out, and a few things I'd justify as catching up on. That year, within the same afternoon the refund hit, it was already in the savings account. I didn't decide whether to save it. The decision was already made, in advance. The researchers who study this call it mental accounting, the tendency for people to treat different pools of money differently depending on how they arrived. Windfall money gets mentally filed as extra, which makes it feel disposable in a way a regular paycheck doesn't. The psychological difference between $100 from a paycheck and $100 from a refund isn't rational. It's the same $100, but it's real. People spend windfall money faster and with less deliberation than earned income, even controlling for the amount. I use that quirk deliberately, in reverse. Redirecting extra money before it ever felt like extra money meant I never had to decide whether to save it in a moment when spending it felt easier. The decision was already made. That $700 refund and the handful of similar windfalls that followed it over the year moved the balance further toward $10,000 than the automated transfer alone ever could have. And it cost me nothing, because I'd never planned to spend it on anything specific. Habit 6. I stopped comparing my progress to other people's visible spending. This one is harder to operationalize than the others because it's not a system, it's a mindset shift that took longer to actually land. But I'm including it because I think it quietly undermined my savings attempts more than any individual bad financial decision ever did. And I think most people who've tried and failed to save consistently have some version of this working against them without ever naming it. The problem with measuring your own progress against what other people appear to have is that you're comparing your full picture against the most curated, most visible sliver of someone else's. A coworker's new car, a friend's vacation photos, a neighbor's renovation, none of those come with a balance sheet attached. And as this channel has covered before, people who look wealthy and people who are actually building wealth are genuinely often not the same group. The visible spending is real. The financial picture underneath it is almost never what it appears to be from the outside. Researchers who study this have documented the effect with some precision. The experience of seeing what neighbors earn or appear to spend significantly affects how people feel about their own financial situation, even when their own income hasn't changed at all. It's sometimes called relative deprivation, the gap between what you have and what you perceive others to have, and it's one of the more reliable drivers of spending decisions that have nothing to do with actual need. People buy things to close the perceived gap, not the real one. I had a coworker around the time I was building toward the $10,000 who seemed, externally, to be doing significantly better than I was. I spent a genuinely embarrassing amount of mental energy in those months, wondering what she was doing differently and whether I was falling behind by comparison. Eventually, I found out, through an unrelated conversation, that the picture underneath what I'd been observing wasn't what it appeared to be at all. What I'd read as evidence of having figured something out was actually closer to the opposite. I'd been measuring my own progress against an illusion and losing to it. The practical version of this habit was simple. I stopped anchoring my lifestyle to what I saw other people spending and started anchoring it to what my own numbers actually said, what my savings rate was, what my balance was, what my actual goal required. Calibrating from the inside out instead of the outside in made every dollar I directed toward the $10,000 feel like an active choice rather than a sacrifice. I wasn't falling behind anyone. I was ahead of where I'd been before. That reframe was real, and it mattered. Habit 7. I reviewed the system once, briefly, every month, and changed nothing unless something was clearly broken. This one sounds like a contradiction after 6 habits about changing things, but it might be the most important one of all. One of the quiet ways people undermine their own savings systems is by constantly tinkering with them, adjusting the amount, trying a new app, redesigning the budget, second-guessing the strategy. Every time the system gets redesigned, it effectively starts over. The compounding effect of a consistent system, the part that actually builds $10,000, requires time, and time requires leaving the system alone long enough to actually work. I did this myself in the years before these habits clicked. I'd read something about a new savings strategy, get excited about it, move my money around, set up a new structure, and then live in the new structure for 2 or 3 months before getting excited about something else and starting over again. Each new system felt like progress because starting a new system feels like taking action, but the account balance never reflected it because nothing ran long enough to accumulate anything real. What I settled into was a monthly check that took maybe 5 minutes. Savings rate, up, flat, or down from last month. Balance, moving toward target. Automated transfers, still running. That was the entire review. If the rate was up or flat, I closed the app and didn't think about it again for another month. If it was down, I asked why once, adjusted one thing if needed, and then left it alone again. The goal was never a perfect system. It was a running system, one that didn't require my daily attention or monthly redesign to keep moving. The 10,000 was a milestone that took roughly 14 months from the day I locked in habits 1 through 6. Not 14 months of perfect execution, there were 2 months in there where the savings rate dropped because something unexpected happened and I had to redirect money. But the system was still running when those months ended, which meant the next month it just picked up where it left off. The gaps didn't reset the whole project. They were just months. That's what a running system does differently from a restarted one. It survives the bad months instead of treating them as reasons to begin again. Looking at all 7 habits together, there's a pattern worth naming that I only saw clearly after the 10,000 was already there. Habits 1, 2, and 5 are all about removing decision from the path of saving, automating, adding friction, and pre-committing before money feels like spending money. Habits 3 and 4 are about keeping the system visible and simple enough to actually sustain. Habits 6 and 7 are about protecting the system from the 2 most common ways people quietly undo the progress they've built: external comparison that turns saving into deprivation, and constant tinkering that prevents anything from running long enough to work. None of them individually is remarkable. Most of them are things people have heard described somewhere before. The difference wasn't knowing about them, it was having all 7 running at the same time, reinforcing each other for long enough that they stopped being conscious habits and became just the way money moved. By the time the balance crossed 10,000, I wasn't thinking about automation or friction or the name on the account. I was just living normally, and the system was doing the rest. The 10,000 wasn't a number I reached in one breakthrough moment. It was the end result of those 7 habits running, quietly, on a repeating schedule, some of them for more than a year before the balance crossed 5 digits. The habits existed before the result did. The result was just proof that the habits were still running. I also want to name something that the 7 habits don't directly address, because it's something I think about a lot in retrospect. What I like about these habits is that the mechanics don't require a particular salary. Automation is still automation. Friction is still friction. A specific target is still more useful than a vague one. What income changes dramatically is the speed. Someone with $2,000 of monthly surplus can move through these habits far faster than someone working with $150, but the mechanics themselves don't change. And the 7th is, if anything, more important when the contributions are smaller, because a smaller running system is still a running system, and any running system compounds over time in a way that no system that keeps getting restarted ever can. In my case, the biggest barrier to my first 10,000 wasn't primarily income. It was the gap between intending to save and actually having a system that kept saving without requiring intention every single time. Intention is unreliable, not because people are careless, but because life generates too many competing demands on attention for a habit that relies on it to survive very long. A system that runs on its own doesn't make those demands. It just keeps going. If you're starting from zero right now, or from somewhere well below where you want to be, the habits worth starting with are 1, 2, and 3, in that order. Automate a transfer for the same day your next paycheck lands, even if the amount feels too small to matter. Move the account somewhere separate, with friction between you and the money. Name the target, specifically, as a number. Those 3 things alone, running consistently, will do more for the balance than any amount of motivation and discipline applied without them. If you've made it this far, you clearly care about understanding money in a way that actually works in real life, not just on a whiteboard. That's exactly what this channel is all about. Every week, I break down personal finance, investing, budgeting, and wealth building into simple, practical lessons anyone can use. If that sounds like something you'd find valuable, consider subscribing. I'd love to have you here. Because the 10,000 wasn't a personality trait. It wasn't a talent. It was a handful of unglamorous habits running in the background long after I'd stopped thinking about them every day. That's the version of this story nobody tells you about. The part where it gets boring, and that's exactly when it's working.